Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. And in today's video, I'm going to be starting the first episode in a series on ecclesiology. This is taken from the classes that I give to people who sign up through my website. So if you're interested in taking this class, you can go ahead and check my website. I'll give you the link right now. You can find it at www.theecclesiablog.com, and you can sign up there. And we can meet once a week and talk about ecclesiology in Joseph Ratzinger and occasionally Thomas Aquinas, but mostly Joseph Ratzinger. So if you take this class, you get a free outline, and you get a bunch of extra content, including, of course, the class itself, where we walk through this and talk about it and explore the ramifications. But here in this video, you're just going to get the kind of the gist of the class. And I'm using these videos as an apologetics series to defend the ecclesiology of the Catholic Church and to present it as the what I would argue is the faithful interpretation of history and the New Testament and what the church is. Of course, it's not exhaustive because we're dealing with a mystery. The church is a mystery, but it's not irrational, and we can know more and more about it the more we study, think, pray, and talk about it with people. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start this first episode on ecclesiology, the Catholic understanding of what the church is. And if you're watching this live, can you just double check and give me a thumbs up if the sound is good? Because I had to do some text stuff, and I want to make sure the sound is still good. So go ahead and put that in the not the show notes, sorry, in the chat box. If the sound is good, give me a thumbs up, or just tell me it's good, and then we'll proceed. Okay, I'll just start the lecture, and I'll just wait for a comment. Okay, so episode 1, we're going to talk about the origin and the nature of the church. Okay, I got a thumbs up from Judith. Thank you. So sound is good. All right. Okay, so the origin and the nature of the church, right? Before we talk about anything, we got to talk about what it is and where it comes from so that we can coherently talk about the thing in particular. So before we look at the origins, I just want to talk about this word covenant, because as you can imagine, it'll be very important for our understanding of the church. And so what is a covenant? Well, it's pretty simple. It's simple, but there's, it's a profound concept that has a lot of ramifications. It's a beautiful concept, but to explain it is pretty simple. Let's see, I have four criteria here. The first one is that a covenant is a bond established between two parties. So far, so good. Two parties. Now, the party in question doesn't have to be an individual, but there must be two parties. It could be two nations, two tribes, one nation and one tribe, one person and one tribe, one people and one God, right? It requires two parties. The second thing about a covenant is that it is established by an oath, right? It's sealed, right? And this oath is usually ritualized. And the word for oath in Latin is the word that we find used in the early church, and it is sacramentum. So this is where we get the word sacrament, right? A sacrament is a sacred oath, a sacred word that establishes a covenant relationship between two parties, in this case, God and the Christian church. So a bond established between two parties, established by an oath that is ritualized. And so actually, that's the third criteria, right? This oath is ritualized. So let me just repeat that. First of all, it's a bond that is established between two parties. Second of all, it's an oath. Third of all, it's an oath that is ritualized. And here we have this very common biblical theme of words and deeds, right? And an example I like to use is shaken on it, right? When you make a promise, you want to make it solemn, you want to make it more binding, you shake on it, right? And there's different ways of ritualizing an oath, but that's the common one that we know of today. Finally, the fourth criterion can be summarized as the outcomes of whether one follows through with their oath or breaks their oath. So here I have fidelity and infidelity. And to these two outcomes corresponds the consequences of curse for infidelity and blessing for fidelity. And these are finally also associated to the blessing is life and the curse is death. So this is a general, simple overview of what a covenant is. To repeat those four criteria, we have a bond established between two parties, established by an oath. The oath is ritualized, and one is either faithful or unfaithful. If they're faithful, they are blessed with life. If they're unfaithful, they are cursed with death. That's a covenant. Okay, let's get into the origins and therefore, as we'll see, the nature of the church. So, first of all, the word church is used in the New Testament, ecclesia in Greek, and it just means assembly or gathering, right? And so, this understanding of the word is important because it has roots in the Old Testament. So, before we look at the Old Testament, I want to quote from John 11 and Matthew 12. So, looking at John 11, verses 51 and 52, we hear John write about Caiaphas that he prophesied that Jesus was about to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but to gather into one the dispersed children of God. So here we see how Jesus gathers the dispersed children of God and assembles them, right? And this is a theme throughout the New Testament with Jesus's role, what his purpose is. And we'll explore that even more in this first part. But this gathering, right? This is something that's clearly there in the text. In fact, Matthew 12, verse 30 says, "Whoever is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather with me scatters." So we have this distinction between gathering, and Jesus is the focal point, right? To be with Jesus is the criterion for gathering. And then who is not with Jesus scatters, division, right? So the roots of this idea of gathering, of assembly, of a people brought together, right? The roots for our understanding of this as the first concept that should come to mind when we think of church, right? The word church is, of course, in the Old Testament, specifically Moses and the founding of the nation of Israel as the people of God, right? So Moses gathers the tribes into a nation at Sinai, and through the word of the law, mediates a covenant between God and Israel, right? This is pretty straightforward biblical history, right? Moses will say, "Let my people go." Sorry, God says this, "Let my people go that they may worship me." Right? So God says this, and Pharaoh lets them go, and Moses gathers them at Sinai and the Ten Commandments, and eventually the establishment of the tabernacle and the way of worship and the law, right? So the people are gathered around a cultic identity, right? Cultic here meaning religious and worship, not cult the way we use the word today, which means a fringe group or something. So that being said, I do want to look, so with Moses in the background, right, and with those two quotes from John 11 and Matthew 12, I now want to look at how Jesus does this gathering. That should tell us a lot about the origin and nature of the church, right, which is a gathering. That's what the word means. So how does Jesus go about this? Well, the first place we go to, the first theme, the first historical event, the first reality in the New Testament that we should immediately think of is the 12, right? Jesus gathers the 12. He gathers other, more people, of course, but the 12 stand out. And why 12, right? So the 12, we read in Mark chapter 3, verses 13 through 16, quote, "He went up the mountain and called to him those whom he wanted, and they came to him. And he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, to be with him and to be sent out to proclaim the message and to have authority to cast out demons. So he appointed the 12." Now, this is an important verse because already we're seeing all the themes that we've started to talk about come together in that verse right there from Mark. So We talked about Jesus saying, "He who is not with me scatters, but he who is with me gathers," right? And here he calls the 12 when he's on a mountain, and he calls them from the mountain. We have echoes of Sinai, and we won't talk about it just yet, but also echoes of Jesus's divinity, right? And so he calls these 12, they come to him, and he appoints them as 12. And we'll look at the symbolism, which is common knowledge among people who study the Bible, but we'll talk about it nonetheless. And then he names them apostles. Now, of course, as it says, as we know, apostle means those who are sent, right? So with this gathering and this communion of being with Jesus comes a mission. And to be sent to, as Mark 3 tells us, proclaim the message. And the message, as we'll also see, refers to the gospel, which is a proclamation, a declaration of a new rule, good news from a new spiritual empire that we'll talk about. But um, why does Mark here, after saying all these profound things about this gathering of the 12 to be with Jesus and the mountain and the calling of them, and then the mission associated with that communion, he then says, and that they have authority to cast out demons. And then he even kind of seals off this section by saying, so he appointed the 12, period. Why the demons? Well, this is actually an interesting thing about demons and casting out demons, because demons are associated with division. And what's opposed to demons is communion, specifically the communion of the church. So let's, real quick, before we look at the word demon and then another word associated with it, let's look at the number 12, right? So the number 12 represents a new people of God. Why? Well, we've been talking about the Old Testament roots of the people of God, of the gathering, right? Which is Israel as a nation, specifically as 12 tribes. So here we have a new Israel being gathered by a new Moses, right? At a mountain to be with Jesus. So a new people of God, Jacob's 12 sons, which end up being the 12 tribes. Okay, let's look at this word demon. Okay, so what I find interesting is how demon is almost an opposite etymologically to the word symbol. Symbol. Why symbol, right? Well, symbol is a Greek compound word. Its etymology comes from the Greek, which is sin balein. So here I have sun balein. It just means to bring together. The word symbol means to bring together. You can see here that's the language of gathering, right? Of gathering people together, of an assembly, right? Now, as we'll also see, the Second Vatican Council speaks of the church as the sacrament of salvation, as the oath, right? As the word that gathers, right? Of salvation. Sacrament here is a sign, it's a covenant, right? Made between people and God. And through that oath, a gathering into one family, into one party of the covenant is established. So, sun balein means to bring together, right? A symbol is when several disparate things are brought together in a way that illuminates a kind of coherence and harmony that points beyond itself through beauty to the good itself, to being itself, right? That's what symbols do. They point us towards spiritual realities. Well, demon comes from the Greek, which is daimon, which means to divide or to scatter, right? So here, just etymologically, and remember the New Testament was written in Greek. Etymologically, we have this really fascinating association with the power and the authority to cast out demons as something given to the 12 that are gathered, right? Into being with Jesus, right? Now, what's also interesting is that the early creeds of the early church were called symbolons, right? Symbols, right? Because the creed pointed to a bringing together into one as expressed, a faith expressed, a yes to God, which is an oath, a covenant oath between God and man. So you see here, the new covenant is a gathering that brings communion, and it's a covenant with Jesus. Now we're going to get into that. So Also, not just the 12, but Jesus gathers 70 others. Some texts will say 72. But either way, this number is from the Old Testament, right? The 70 and the 72. And it's also from the time of Moses. We read in Luke chapter 10, verse 1, quote, "After this, the Lord appointed 70 others and sent them on ahead." Let me reread that. "After this, the Lord appointed 70 others and sent them on ahead of him in pairs to and every town and place where he himself intended to go." So here we have the number of non-Jewish peoples of the world is something that I learned from reading Joseph Ratzinger's book, Called to Communion. Now, notice the title of Ratzinger's book, Called to Communion. It's a beautiful, wonderful little book. Strongly recommend, right? Encapsulates everything I've been saying so far, right? The call and the communion that we just saw in Mark 3. Well, the 70 in the Jewish mindset represented the Gentiles, right? It's also tied, as we saw, to Moses and the elders that he appoints, right? But it does have this what would be called a pan-Israelite um, connotation, right? So the 70 is the number of non-Jewish peoples of the world, as we see in Genesis 10, in Exodus 1, specifically verse 5, and in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. If you want to pause, rewind, write down those citations and look them up, that'd be a fruitful thing to do. Okay, so this gathering that Jesus does for us to be with Jesus, well, what does it what is it constituted by, right? What is the nature of this gathering? Well, the first thing we see is the Our Father. So Luke chapter 11 verse 1 reads, quote, "He was praying in a certain place, and after he had finished, one of his disciples said to him, 'Lord, teach us to pray as John taught his disciples.'" End quote. I want to focus in on that because why is that passage put at the end other than it's just a historical recounting, right? But why is it a significant passage in this verse? As John taught his disciples. And the reason why is because this was a common practice when you had a teacher and followers. He taught them a common prayer that represented the identity of that gathering. In fact, in Pope Benedict's Call to Communion, he writes, "Among the religious groups of the surrounding milieu, a special rule of prayer is, in fact, a badge of their community." End quote. Now, Ratzinger here is not just making this up. He's drawing it from Jeremias, a New Testament scholar, from a book that I don't know if it's been translated, but in German it would be New Testamentliche Theologie from Goethals in 1971 on page 166, just to give you that reference. Okay, so this communion of the disciples, right, is united to Jesus, right? These people that enter into communion, they are united to Jesus on the basis of prayer, just like with other groups, like John the Baptist taught them to pray. So belonging to this new people of Jesus is not now associated with the physical descent from the Jewish people, but it's associated with being with Jesus. This being with will become crucial, and we'll see how ecclesiology and Christology will tie together. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So we have another quote here from Joseph Ratzinger from the book Called to Communion. He says, "Quote: The request for a prayer thus expresses the disciples' awareness of having become a new community that has its source in Jesus. They appear as the primitive cell of the church, and they show us at the same time that the church is a communion united principally on the basis of prayer with Jesus, which gives us a shared openness to God." So prayer is crucial. Now, we've got to be careful not to reduce prayer merely to a kind of openness of the mind to God through an internal dialogue. It includes all of that, of course, but prayer is much more existential. Ratzinger will go as far as to say is that the culminating instance of Jesus's prayer looks like the Paschal mystery, like the death on the cross. He describes Jesus's very being as he calls it pro-existence, right? It's existential, right? Your whole existence is taken up into it. So prayer is not just nice words you say on your own or with others. Prayer involves your whole existence. It's a forness, a pro-existence that is radical. In fact, with Jesus, it's unto the end, right? So we'll see how prayer here is the first step. The Our Father is the first step of this gathering, right? But the next step is going to be the Last Supper, where that word, right, is made flesh. That covenant oath is ratified in a ritual, one that expresses an existential gift of self, right? This being with Jesus means having sharing in his pro-existence, sharing in his sacrifice, which we will get into as well. So let's look at the next step of this gathering of this new people of God. Well, we talked about the Our Father, but what's the next step of this gathering? Of course, you guessed it. It is the Last Supper, where this is taken to the next level, right? It's been cranked up a few notches, right? So here we have the words of institution, right? This is my body given for you. This is my blood, the blood of the new covenant, shed for many and for the forgiveness of sins. These words are so important because as the gathering itself, right? The 12, the 70, the mountain, the calling, the mission, as all those things, the words of institution have Old Testament roots. And it's so important to be aware of Old Testament roots in order to properly interpret and understand the New Testament. So crucial. We read, for example, in Jeremiah 31 through 33, a famous passage, quote, "The days are surely coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel." A new covenant. Okay. "I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." So the first thing to point out is that he's speaking of a new covenant. Well, we call the New Testament the New Testament, the New Covenant. Covenant and testament here being interchangeable, although there are distinctions, but that would be for a different conversation. But the New Covenant, the New Testament, right? So it's new. That's the crucial point. Foretold by Jeremiah. But also it involves a certain inwardness. It involves a something that has to do with the heart, but also with an internalization, right? "I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts." Let's quote here from Pope Benedict, when before he was Pope, Joseph Ratzinger. This is from a different book, but listen carefully to this passage. It's quite a beautiful passage, and it makes a lot of connections that are so crucial if you want to understand ecclesiology, Catholic ecclesiology. He says, this is from the book Many Religions, One Covenant. Quote, "The reference to the cup in Matthew and Mark comes straight from the account of the making of the Sinai covenant. Moses sprinkles the sacrificial blood first on the altar, which represents the hidden God, and then on the people, saying, 'Behold the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words.'" This is from Exodus 24, verse 8. The fictitious blood relationship thus created, Ratzinger tells us, makes the participants brothers of the same flesh and blood. The covenant creates a whole, which is peace, shalom. God enters into a mysterious blood relationship with them in such a way that he now belongs to them and they to him. That's all the Old Testament, right? Now, when Jesus offers the cup to the disciples and says, "This is the blood of the covenant," the words of Sinai are heightened to a staggering realism because he's among us. God is among us. He's not just hidden with the symbol of the altar, right? A staggering realism. And at the same time, we begin to see a totally unsuspected depth in them, in the words of Moses. What takes place here is both spiritualization and the greatest possible realism. especially because he actually sheds his blood. For the sacramental blood fellowship that now becomes a possibility brings those who accept it into an utterly concrete and corporeal community with the incarnate human being, Jesus, and hence with his divine mystery. End quote. So we see here how Sinai has very similar language and it's establishing a covenant. We become blood partners with God, but God is not incarnate at Sinai. But here in the new covenant foretold by Jeremiah, echoes of this Sinai covenant are in the words of Jesus themselves, where he says, "This is my blood." But the realism is staggering because he's among us. He's one of us right there in our midst, right? For the apostles. And so there's a heightening. So it's a spiritualization of the communion, but it's also a staggering realism because his presence is literally, think of the word itself, real, right? In all its depth, that word, real. Christ's presence is real. He's right there. And so he gives himself, and this blood covenant where they receive the chalice and drink it, right? The internalization of Jesus's pro-existence takes place. And we're going to look at this a little bit more in a wonderful way. But let's quote one more passage here from Called to Communion, going back to that book by Joseph Ratzinger. He writes, quote, "With Passover and the Sinaitic covenant ritual, the two founding acts whereby Israel became and ever anew becomes a people are taken up and integrated into the Eucharist." That's a crucial section right there. I want you to think about that. With Passover, the themes of Passover are clearly present, right? I mean, no one denies this in the New Testament account of the Last Supper, but also the Sinaitic, right? It's using Sinai as an adjective, right? That covenant ritual is also clearly present. And we'll see there's more stuff that's present too. These two founding events, founding acts of God, of the people of God in the Old Testament, become and ever anew becomes the constitution of the people in the New Testament, right? But as understood within the realism of the Eucharist. So the Eucharist here fulfills these two events in a new way. It incorporates them and transforms them. It spiritualizes them, right? But also not just the movement up and the spiritualization, but also the fact that God became flesh, right? The realism, the incarnational presence, right? You have both these movements up and down, right? The spiritualization and this enfleshment, right? In fact, a lot here could be said about how this ties into our understanding of the resurrection of the flesh and how the Eucharist is the food of mortality, right? It actually spiritualizes our bodies. Okay. Ratzinger continues in that same quote, "The association of this primordial cultic basis that we talked about in the Old Testament, upon which Israel was founded and by which it lived, with the core words of the prophetic tradition that we talked about in Jeremiah, fuses past, present, and future in the perspective of a new covenant." In other words, the Last Supper is a massive synthesis. It's a fulfillment, right? It's the fulfillment of all these expectations of what they pointed to. The old points to the new reveals the meaning of the old. We have to know where in the old things are being referenced to understand the new. Okay, another quote here, which is really important. Let me make sure. This is from Called to Communion on page 27. Ratzinger writes, "Just as the old Israel once revered the temple as its center and the guarantee of its unity, and by its common celebration of the Passover enacted this unity in its own life, in like manner, this new meal is now the bond uniting a new people of God. There is no longer any need for a center localized in an outward temple." So I want to stop right there, right? Outward, inward, right? That's a crucial interpretive lens. the distinction between outward, external, and inward, internal, used by Augustine, by St. Thomas, by St. Bonaventure, by the entire tradition. It's the best way, I think, to describe the relationship between the Old and the New Testament. Outward, external, inward, internal. So just as old Israel, as we talked about, once revealed the temple as its center and the guarantee of its unity, of its gatheringness, of its identity as a people, as a kind of proto church, right? Well, it is a church, it is a gathering, right? But we'll see that New Testament church, there's more to it. And by its common celebration of the Passover, another link to its unity, to its right. This celebration of the Passover enacted this unity in its own life. In like manner, what is the church? Where does it come from? In like manner, this new Last Supper, this new meal, this new Passover meal, which is also a Sinai covenant of a new kind, is now the bond of uniting a new people of God. This is the source of the church. The Eucharist brings about the gathering, the communion of the church. And we'll also see how the church confects the Eucharist through the sacramental dimension, right? Because it's God who brings the church to being ever anew. It's never a democracy where we get together and agree on things and make the church ourselves. God makes it. Hence the need of the sacramental and the succession, but we'll talk about that. Okay, so there is no longer, Ratzinger says, any need for a center localized in an outward temple. The body of the Lord, which is the center of the Lord's Supper, is the one new temple that joins Christians together in a much more real unity than a temple made of stone could ever do. I really want you guys to focus on that sentence. It's so crucial to understanding so much of ecclesiology. You have here both a universalizing, a kind of spiritualizing away from local places like the temple, and also a reality that is intensified in comparison to the old, that up and downward movement, right? A realism that is more real than the old. So let me reread that sentence, right? There is no longer any need for a center localized in an outward temple in a particular place. The body of the Lord, which is extremely real, which is the center of the Lord's Supper, is the one new temple that joins Christians together into a much more real unity than a temple made of stone could ever do. Because it's not just the altar in the Sinai narrative that represents the hidden God, but it's the revealed God who is visible. He who sees me sees the Father, right? In the flesh, the Word was made flesh. The realism here is it turned up many notches, right? And yet universalized by being dissociated from the local temple. You see, this is oftentimes in apologetics, I find, I don't want to be too critical. I mean, I'm doing my best as well. So, I'm not. Anyway, the point being is that sometimes I hear spirit and matter being pitted against each other, where it's like some Protestants will say the Old Testament is this earthy, material testament, and the New is the spiritual and more individualistic testament, right? That is doesn't need sacraments. But sometimes the Catholic will reply that no, the New Testament is the much more fleshly and tangible and not so spiritual after all. But the issue here is that we're all jumping onto certain aspects of things and not seeing the big picture, which is that there's a lot of truth in all of those things. The way I would put it is that the old is the local and the material, and therefore shadowy and less real, right? Well, a lot of modern materialism starts to become apparent here in Christians when they think this way, right? The material is not the more real. It's the spiritual that's more real, not the material. So the material is like less real. It's the shadow of what is really real, right? So that's the Old Testament. But then in the New Testament, right, spirit becomes flesh, God becomes flesh, word becomes flesh, right? And thereby flesh is spiritualized, resurrection. So you have both the descending and ascending. You need that whole picture. Oftentimes polemics is just grasping onto aspects and fighting when it misses the point here. So you have a strong realism, true presence, right? But it's also not a materialism, right? Which I do hear some Catholics kind of go down that route. Anyway, okay. Now, here's another thing that the words of institution encapsulate. I mean, we talked about Jeremiah, we talked about Sinai, Passover. What else do we have? We have Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. Isaiah 53, verse 12 says, quote, "Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death." Poured out, right? "And was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors." The pouring out and the many, right? In these words of institution, you also have the themes of the suffering servant. Talk about an incredible synthesis in this fulfillment of the new covenant, of the new people of God assembled by the call of God, by the word of God, Jesus himself, who is now present in the midst in a much more real way, and thereby being with him is the criterion of belonging to this people, not biological descent. So you have both this spiritual aspect and this radically more real aspect than the old. Again, all of these things come together. Now, we talked about the fact that this is a new covenant. It's a new Passover. It's a new sacrifice. Therefore, there must be a new priesthood, the priesthood of Christ, of Melchizedek, as we'll see. Long story there, but a new priesthood, right? And therefore, a new worship. But all of this also means, as we've hinted at, a new temple, which is not local in the sense of the one in Jerusalem, but the body of the Lord. In fact, Mark 14, verse 58, Matthew 26, verse 61, Mark 15, verse 29, Matthew 27, verse 40, and John 2, verse 19, and finally Mark 11, verses 15 through 19, all make this explicitly clear that the new temple is the Lord's body. In fact, Matthew 12, verse 6 says, quote, "I tell you, something greater than the temple is here." Something beyond, greater, more universal, more spiritual in a certain sense. But John 2:21, right? He tells us the famous passage, "But he was speaking of the temple of his body," which is particular, which is the word made flesh. You see, you have both here. But now Jesus's body is the new temple, but his body, that's what we call the church. The assembly of the new people of God has a Christological basis as the body of Christ. So, quote here from Call to Communion. Actually, before I quote it, here's how I want to introduce this quote. "The Last Supper, the Eucharist, is the making of a covenant." That should be clear. "The concrete foundation of a new people." That should follow from everything we've said. So Ratzinger says, quote, "The people comes into being through its covenant relation to God." Period, end quote. I love how he can synthesize things like that in just very pithy, profound, simple statements. Let me reread that. "The people comes into being through its covenant relation to God." Period. And that is the Eucharist, right? So here are the origins of the church. Another quote from Call to Communion. He says, "It could be said that the people of the new covenant takes its origin as a people from the body and blood of Christ. Solely in terms of this center does it have the status of a people. We can call it people of God only because it is through communion with Christ, being with, that man gains access to a relationship with God that he cannot establish by his own power. Period." That becomes crucial as we start to explore further ramifications and development in ecclesiology. Relationship with God that he cannot establish by his own power. Coming together and agreeing upon our interpretation of Scripture is not enough to be a church. It's by the power of God of the sacraments. And I don't just mean Eucharist, but the sacraments of the succession of priesthood, right? It's not man who makes the church, it's God who makes the church. So merely agreeing on our interpretation of Scripture and coming together and realizing, oh yeah, we agree, or let's say we don't agree, but we talk it through and like, okay, I come to see what you mean, and we agree, and we form a congregation, right? This is a type of ecclesiology that is overly congregational and not communal in the deepest sense of the word communal, communion, in the body, in the sacrament, which comes from God. We don't make the church. God makes the church. We're already seeing here how Catholic ecclesiology um, does not jive with certain iterations of low church Christian ecclesiology. Now, so Ratzinger says that looking ahead to our principal theme, the local church and the universal church, which we'll look at, we can say that the Eucharist, seen as the permanent origin and center of the church, joins all of the many, Isaiah, right, who are now made a people to the one Lord and to his one and only body, the one and the many into one. Now, there's a passage that's very crucial, which is 1 Corinthians 10, 16, and 17, specifically 17. Though we are many, because there is one loaf of bread, we are one. And we partake. We'll talk about that word partake, koinonia in Greek, communion, right? Okay, so this fact, Ratzinger says, of the one body which gathers the many, this fact already implies that the church and her unity are but one. It is true that the many celebrations in which the one Eucharist will be realized also point ahead to the multiformity of the one body in many places, right? Nevertheless, it is clear that these many celebrations cannot stand side by side as autonomous, mutually independent entities, but are always simply the presence of one and the same mystery. So we'll get into that. How does the local and the universal relate? And it's important that we understand that a gathering, right, cannot be independent and autonomous, or it would not be the church that God creates, but one that man creates through agreement, right? Okay, so that's the first part, right? The origins and a glimpse of the nature, but the nature of the church we'll look at in part two. But that's the first glimpse of the origins of the church and what the word means. Now, in part two, we're going to look at the implications of this. And there's three ways in which we can understand the nature of the church, three important ways. And then we'll get into the juicy stuff, the talk about the apostolic succession and scripture tradition, what that is, and the relationship between the early apostolic church and the heresy of Gnosticism. That's my favorite topic right there. But I hope you see here that Catholic ecclesiology, right, interprets the New Testament in light of the Old Testament that is being hearkened by the very words of the New Testament. And the word church is a gathering of what is scattered, of the many, into the one body of the Lord, into the being with Jesus, into the sharing in his pro-existence, which is prayer. His whole being is prayer. And so we gather on the basis of the Our Father, which makes those who follow Christ a group, like there was those who follow John the Baptist. But this prayer is heightened in the realism of a sacrificial and priestly, covenant that establishes a new temple of the being with the body of the Lord. He was speaking of his body, John tells us. This is the origin of ecclesiology, and we can see how deeply tied it is to Christology, and how the Eucharist features at the very heart of it. And so in part two, we will look, after having looked at the origin of the church, at the nature of the church. What is this gathering? So if you enjoyed this first episode on ecclesiology, consider going to www.theecclesiablog.com and signing up to my ecclesiology course, where we'll walk through Catholic ecclesiology, specifically through the lens of Joseph Ratzinger, which will answer a lot of questions that you might have. And if you enjoy this kind of content, make sure you like the video, make sure you subscribe. It really helps, because I know more people watch than they subscribe. It really helps if you subscribe to the channel as well, and hit that notification bell so that you know when the next video comes out. And if you watch this series, it'll give you a very good grasp, I hope, right, on the nature, the origins, the nature of the church, and the implications. And it will help you in apologetics. That's my goal. So consider supporting me at patreon.com/the Logos Project so that I am not homeless. Just kidding. Okay. Without further ado, we'll see you guys for the next episode on Ratzingerian apologetics. Thank you all, and God bless.